Hey, what's up? This is the Flyover Libertarian podcast, where three unimportant people from an unimportant place give you the opinion that you didn't ask for. I'm Io Ancap.
And I am Daribely, the newest member here.
Yeah. So, in fact, that's what we're going to talk about today is we're going to introduce our new member. If you've been paying attention to our Facebook page or following us on Twitter, you may have noticed that we added a new member to our team. His name is Daribely, and he's been on our podcast a couple times as a guest, but this is the first time he is on as a host and as a member of the team. He's a longtime friend of ours, and we're excited for you guys to get to know him a little bit better and hear him talk about things other than Bitcoin, though he'll probably talk a lot about that too. So let's start off with tell us a little bit about yourself and give us your origin story.
Sure, happy to. So, I grew up in the unimportant state that we all have come to love. To a couple of parents, I grew up in the church with an upbringing that was some form of somewhere between conservative and soft libertarian. My dad grew up in a pretty conservative house. My mother really just wanted the government to leave her alone. And so from childhood, I had an awareness of, just leave me alone. It wasn't even that the government was bad. It's just, just leave me alone. I'll be okay. Pretty typical evangelical Christian upbringing. The church is good. America is good. The flag is good. All those things. I did the typical college thing, went to school, got a degree, moved to a different city for a job, started working at the job. I used to work for the government, and that'll come back up some later in the conversation, but I don't anymore, and I'm super glad that I don't. My introduction into the practicality of libertarianism or just even actually caring about politics or economics did come from Bitcoin. So I heard of Bitcoin in middle of 2017, and first was interested in it simply because I wanted to get rich. So at the end of 2017, the price of Bitcoin hit about $20,000, and then the bull run ended, and the prices started coming down for about a year and a half to 2 years. So it was at that point that I was disenchanted with the money making, and for whatever reason, never left the ecosphere. Lots of people who find out about Bitcoin and are in it for the money. Once they start losing money, they're like, never mind, I'm no longer interested, and they leave for whatever reason. And whatever it was, I stuck around. I started learning the economics of Bitcoin. I started learning the politics of Bitcoin. Started learning the efficacy of Bitcoin and the fundamental morality of a sound money versus the degeneration of an unsound money. And that led me to more and more libertarian mindsets, more and more awareness of the inefficiencies of central planning of anything, governments, currencies, and a promotion of decentralization. Which also, touches on the permissionless aspect of Bitcoin, which touches on the open source aspect of Bitcoin. And that has crept into other parts of my life. So again, everything came from Bitcoin, but it's kind of seeped into everywhere, where at this point, I want a world where everyone can participate freely, economically, politically, whatever that looks like, in their neighborhood. I just want people to be able to have a fair say in what goes on in their life. Going back to what my mother said, I just want the government to leave them alone. I just want to be able to live my life. And recently, in the last couple of months, that has led me to a big interest in Agorism as a philosophy, as the application of my political and economic opinions. Where I find that many libertarians, myself included, we really like to whine about the problems of the world. And then we go to the bar and we drink beer and we whine about the problems down there. And then we go home and we whine to our wives who roll their eyes at us saying, oh, here you go again. And it's very easy to end there. Like if the sum of my political or economic opinions is annoying people with my whining, I've accomplished nothing except for actually making the world a worse place. And so I've really started to wrestle with, how do I, as a human, as a Christian, as a father, as a husband, how do I implement these opinions that I have in such a way that I can make the world a better place, make the economy better, provide better for people I may never meet through the invisible hand of the market, and ultimately, as a Christian, to spread the kingdom of God and to speak truth into a very, very broken world.
It sounds like a lot of your story mirrors a lot of what Rural Rothbard and I talked about on our origin stories conversation, which you can find flyover.page/episodes, and you go look for episode 1, our first ever podcast episode, which we're coming up on our 1 year anniversary of our first podcast episode, which leads me to think we really should have done more than 14 episodes by now. So, but here we are. But I think there's some one of the things you talked about there. I've heard a couple things that I think I'd love to cue in on, I guess. One of the things is like the issue of doing something. And I think there's I guess I have two minds of that. And so I don't fully disagree, but I don't fully agree with the concept that like just saying what the problem is not enough. I guess sometimes I think like I would say like my big thing, like I'm not into any of these sort of crypto anarchism sort of stuff that you and Rural Rothbard are getting more and more into, and it's largely because I just have no interest in it, and so it's hard for me to focus on things that I'm not interested in. Like it's not that I don't see the value in it. I just myself am like it's not as interesting to me. I'm more of an ideas guy, and also it's just kind of like not like if I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna do it full, you know. And it seems like you're kind of that same way. Like if you're gonna get into something, you're gonna get into it full way, and I'm just not in a position where I can do it full way. And so on the one hand, I'd say like I think it is very valuable to do things, and to do more than just pointing out the problems, to come up with alternative ways of doing and living and stuff like that. But I also think there's something to the fact of like sometimes pointing out the problems with the state is enough in a sense. Like in a sense that like for me it was very freeing to just come to a point where I could say, oh, so they really aren't on my side. Like it was kind of a freeing moment, you know, where like I no longer had to be like, oh, so I mean, why are they making these stupid decisions? Why can't someone up there just do the right thing? Like, oh, well, that's because the whole system is against you and it all wants you dead, and that's the whole point of it. Like they want you dead, but they'll settle for your compliance, as Michael Malice says. And yet, I think to go further, like at the same time, like why do I think that's a value? I think it's a value because then people stop waiting for the government to do something for them, and they start looking for alternative ways to accomplish those same goals. And really, like what you're talking about, like with like Bitcoin and things like that, like those are ways, right? Those are ways to like stop waiting for government to have a sound money policy. Just get sound money.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with you. And I think actually your opinion on this and my opinion are in agreement. There's actually no disagreement. So I'm saying something has to be done, and you're saying education is a good thing. And I'm saying that's both true, because I've reached the point where, for whatever reason, I have become educated to a point where now I am compelled to action. And for me, action is joining a podcast. Like a year ago, I would have laughed at you. Whereas, and this podcast, the purpose of it is more education. And so everybody has to learn that the government is not for them before they even could possibly start doing something. And for many people, learning it and realizing it will be enough. Where, And, as far as I know, my mother has never done anything particularly against the government, but she's complained about them a whole lot. And that awareness has started me on a process to maybe the culmination of my political career involves being on a podcast for a couple of years. And if that's it, great. And that is my action, and somebody else will be galvanized because of it, or they won't. But the point is, I started because I wanted to get rich. I learned, I became convinced, and then I became convicted to start acting on it. And it's just, so, I mean, I can start the education for people I don't know on the internet. Hello, people on the internet, I don't know you. And then I can start the education of the people who are closest to me, which is my family. And at this point, they've stopped rolling their eyes at me and started actually listening. And then I can start looking at other ways that are less about information and more about just the free market in my community, where I can, the Agorism talks about, creating microeconomies that are anti-fragile, that are robust against economic shocks or apocalypses or something, where I don't need to worry about where my meat's coming from because I buy it directly from the farmer. And the same with my eggs, and the same, I don't need to worry about my mechanic because he lives next to me. And so that's the implementation that I am beginning to wrestle with mentally. And then, of course, to do it all in a Christian context where I have to obey the imperatives given to me by the general and the special revelation. I have to glorify God in all that I do. And that might be doing things that I don't want to do. And it might be raising my voice when I'm really uncomfortable. And I need to start identifying where those are so that I can continue my education and the education of people around me.
You mentioned how your mom just complained about the government and stuff like that. And I think in some ways, like there's a sense in which a libertarian should never complain about the government, because there is a sense in which complaining implies you expected it to be better. Like I wish they weren't wasting all the money. Well, the money wasting is the point. So why are you complaining about it? Like, I think I think almost in a sense every libertarian should have a comedic streak to us, because we're like, it's more of a comedy than a tragedy when the government or the state screws up, because we're like, well, of course the state screws up. That's the point. It's not just even that, like, complaints also implies like most of the time it's like, oh, stupid government, if only they would get their act together. But as as Bob Murphy often tells us, the government isn't stupid. Like, it's not stupid that they're taxing cigarettes and then subsidizing the tobacco farmers. That's the whole point. The whole point, they tax it and then they subsidize it, because the whole point of politics is getting votes and remaining in power. And this is the sort of thing you do. It's not stupidity. It's the whole point of the government. Like, it's the whole point of the state. And, once you get to the point of realizing the state isn't stupid or incompetent, it's evil, then you're like, well, why bother complaining about it anymore? Now the point isn't getting up and complaining and saying, there's a better way of doing it. The point at this point is telling everyone else, hey, there's there's a man behind the curtain, right? There's no wizard. The whole thing is meant to be this way. You aren't. They were never going to keep these promises. Like, everyone's shocked that this big old COVID stimulus bill is filled with pork that's going to overseas countries and only $600 per person, or maybe they'll get $2,000, or maybe Mitch McConnell's going to block it. But like, they're like, well, it's a COVID stimulus bill. Isn't it supposed to help people? The point was never helping people. The point was getting you to comply. And if they can throw you a couple peanuts to get you to comply, that's what they're going to do. The point was never to help you. The point was to control you and to get you to vote for them. And once you see that, like, there's no reason to complain. Now you just laugh or rage. Like, those are the only options at that point,
Rage is fun every now
and
and
find
then.
another way. Yeah, well, righteous indignation is what I like to call it. Yeah, but you know, that's why I think there's a difference. Maybe what I was being oversensitive about calling it complaining. Like, it's not really complaining to just go out and say this is wrong. It's complaining to say, why isn't it going right? And I think there's the two steps to it. I think and I think in many ways there's kind of like, there's got to be people who are out there explaining the philosophy, and there's got to be people explaining the practicality. And you can't explain the practicality if you're not doing the practicality. You know, like, I always think of, like, if you're taking a practical taking a class on finance, business finance, and you find out your professor has never made a dime in his life, like, you're not going to take any of what he says seriously. But if you walk in and you find out this person was CEO of a Fortune 500 company and they've been to the top and they know how it works, then you're like, oh, okay, this person actually has something to say. They've done this before. They know how it works, And so I think that's, that's an important part of it. And so, you said you wanted to talk more about work in the government. What did you do with the government, and how are you using that to undermine it? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so I worked for a municipality, a city, in a flyover state. I worked at the airport in the state. And
hey, so you were where they stopped by while flying over.
Well, mostly they just flew over, and they said, yeah, no, we're not stopping there. That's loser country.
Turn the plane around.
So as I was forming opinions about the efficacy of governments and the fact that taxation is theft, I realized I needed some skin in the game. Like, I was not comfortable being a proponent of any of the things that I believe in while being paid by a government. Full disclosure, the airport I worked for was actually self-sufficient, so it didn't take tax revenue. But it was the principal thing. Most airports the size of the airport that I used to work at, are not self-sufficient. So the fees that they generate at the airport are not enough to cover their expenses. And so most airports do, in fact, take tax revenue. Mine did not, but it was the matter of principle, especially since most people don't realize that. So if I was telling people that taxation is theft and they knew that I worked at the airport, there would be some cognitive dissonance there, where they wouldn't take what I was saying because I wasn't living it. And so it really got to the point where, from a promotion education perspective, I wasn't going to have any credibility, as well as I just was no longer comfortable with it. I disagree with the existence of governments enough that I was willing to get out. It coincided with actually not liking my job in general, as well as becoming interested in my new career. And so the timing of everything worked out pretty well. And then there was a pandemic, and then I was like, yeah, what the heck? And so I got a new job. I now work for a private entity that pays me because it generates a profit that people voluntarily give their money to the company. And I'm proud of that, because...
Dirty, stinking capitalists.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, it's not perfect. The government still has its little dirty fingers in there, but I am now in a voluntary agreement with my employer, and I'm paid by people who voluntarily give up their money for the services that my company provides. And I take a whole lot of pride in that, because it aligns with my political and my moral opinions. Also, they have beer Fridays, where at the office sometimes they take out the company card on a slow day and they run down to the gas station or the grocery store and grab a 12-pack and then pass them around in the last couple hours of work. And you can get fired doing that at the government. So I'm just in a happier place in general.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have a lot of beer Fridays at my job either.
No.
Some people tend to frown on their pastors drinking on the job.
Tea Fridays.
But yeah, that's what's that?
Tea Fridays, orange juice Fridays.
Tea Friday. A little bit of grape juice in a cup.
Dollar store cola Fridays.
We dig into the communion supplies, those little cups with grape juice in it. I'll be honest. I'm gonna say on the agorism topic, I don't have, I don't know what I think about agorism as a whole. To be honest, like I'm still kind of working through it. Not the practice of it. Like the practice of it just seems just straightforward.
Right.
Like I mean, work. Yeah. I mean, why wouldn't it be smarter to do things that can't be disrupted by government action? Like that just makes a lot of sense.
It's reflective of our world where we have to come up with a fancy philosophical term for everyday life for most of humanity.
Yeah.
Like we have to create an entirely new mindset in order to justify buying food from the farmer 2 blocks down, when for all of recorded history, except for the last 100 years, that's what you did. And for most of the world, that's still what you do. So it really is the insanity of our culture and the sanity of our mindset. And I really can only speak as a Midwestern American, where like this is mind-blowing. That's a little embarrassing.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, what we call, what is often called agorism, I'm like, isn't that just, like, I did grow up in a farmer country, and a lot of times it would be like, hey, this farmer's, who's got a bunch of cattle, do you want to buy a cow from me? And I don't know, we didn't have to go through a, government-approved grocery store in order to do that. It was usually a relative, honestly, who would be like, all right, we're slaughtering a cow, do you want part of it? And we would pay for it. We'd pay them for it. I don't think the government ever taxed us for that, or taxed either side for that. And it's just like, this is just what we would do. Like, you knew someone who had milk, you would ask for, hey, before you send it off, could we buy a couple bottles off of you? And like that's all it is. Like, you have people who know each other, who are close, and you trust the worker, you trust the person. Like, it seems interesting to me that we have gotten to the point where we just kind of assume that the way we do things is the way that we have to do things. Like that, like you have to pay some mega corporation who owns a bunch of grocery stores to centrally plan where all of the meat comes from, to be the middleman, to center, to make sure it all goes where it goes. Like we've become so used to that we think any other way is unsafe, but we're like, well, this is what people have done for a long, long time. It seems, I don't know. It seems more like seems more like this modern idea is untested. Kind of like what we say about education, right? Where we've gotten the point where, like, the way public schools are run now, we're like, this is the way public schools are running. Like, what are you doing? You're homeschooling?
Right.
You're going to a classical academy? Like, what? Wow, I mean, this is kind of crazy. I'm just going to stick with what I know, which is public schools. And we're like, no, what you're doing is crazy. That's only been around since, what, the 50s? Like, that really, what we now know isn't really that old. And it's honestly failed so horribly. Just looking at every metric of education, like, it's failed so horribly. So why is it that the impetus is on me to justify my thing,
right? When
my way of education has been working for much longer.
Yes.
And in fact, the so-called geniuses who came up with this system, they were educated in this other way, Like, all these things that, like, would seem like these brand new concepts, or these things that have to have some kind of philosophical justification, is just the way people do things. I think where I get hung up a little bit is I'm not sure that I am all together there on Konkin's philosophy. Now, fair warning, I haven't read it all myself. I'm going based on secondhand from both his fans and from his detractors. And I have people that I trust on both sides who are talking about him. And what the detractors have said make me nervous, and what the fans have said make me interested. So what that means is I need to actually figure out what I think about it myself. And I have a lot of other reading on my list before I can get to that. So I can't speak to his philosophy, but I think what we call agorism as a practice is just kind of like, well, it's just about taking control of your life and not waiting for government to tell you what to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
what can sell you meat.
I think rural America, particularly small town farm country, still has that in a way that most of unrural America doesn't understand, like you said. So I grew up in a town of about 50,000 people, and this kind of stuff is totally foreign to me. I was in high school when my family bought our first half a cow because we met a family through the homeschool group. So it was because we were being counterculture in that we met the cow people. But all my groceries came from the grocery store. All my plumbing came from the plumber. And so like I think it still exists, and I really just think that the loudest voices are the ones that don't understand it. Also, there is, and I'm going to be stereotyping super hard here, there's an inverse correlation between hickness and technological abilities, stereotypically. And the big cities are the places where all the tech happens, and the tech is where all the news happens. So the people who live in the big cities have never bought half a cow because they don't know anybody, because the nearest cow sellers are 20, 30 hour minute, yep, or a 20, 30, 60 minute drive away. And so I think it's kind of an echo chamber where the people who think that this mindset is groundbreaking and new are the ones who didn't grow up doing it every single day with their cousin down the road who just slaughtered their cow.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that too is like it also works the other direction too, right? Where like we're trying to talk to our rural friends and neighbors. Like I live in what's considered a small town now, although I kind of chuckle every time I hear them call it that, because I grew up in far smaller. So like whenever anyone calls my current town a small town, I'm like, okay, sure. I mean, you have 2 Chinese restaurants, but okay. But and 2 coffee shops. It's always so crazy to me. But like I think there's also a sense in which the downside or the positive, like like you're saying, we have to come up with philosophical justifications for just the way life works in rural areas. And at the same time, rural people have no time for philosophy. And so there comes a point where you're like, sometimes that's also a detriment, because then they just think, well, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal. And like I can't tell you how many times I've gotten weird looks when I've said, like for instance, when I said, sometimes I actually tweeted about this. I would often say people would call Biden a leftist and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris leftists, and I would say they're not. They're not leftists. That's not what they are. And they'd be like, "What are you talking about? Of course they are." No, they're not leftists. Like, well, but they're looking for centralized control. But that's not all leftism. Like that's centrists are about central control as well as leftists, but to different ends. Like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are capitalists. Like that, they are capitalists. I know that we sometimes are a little bit nervous about that, us on the ANCAP side, letting anyone slightly to the to the center, to the left, or with authoritarian tendencies call themselves capitalists, but they're capitalists. They're just not free market capitalists. They're central planning capitalists. Like the Keynesians want markets. They don't want complete. They want ownership. They just want them to own it.
Right.
Whereas a socialist doesn't want any ownership. They want to abolish the concept of private property ownership. And so I'm trying to explain this to them, because I think it matters, and yet they're just like giving me blank stares. And in fact, I'm like, honestly, what they are is worse than a socialist. what they do is the result has resulted in more death than almost any other ideology ever. But it's hard to convince them, and I guess the count, obviously that's somewhat academic because I'm explaining to them something. I'm mostly trying to prepare them for the debates they're going to get it with other people online, and these concepts, they come up there and people get confused, and I'm trying to prepare them. But that is, still, we both agree that they're the enemy, But then it comes to the point of being like, well, not every Republican is your friend.
Right.
And I think in some ways Trump has been helpful in that way, that as people become fans of Trump or enemies of Trump, they're realizing that that's true because Trump is so divisive. But then to go even further and to say like, and there's options outside of republicanism. Like you can not wait for the government to make these good things happen. You can just do these good things.
Right.
Like you can stop waiting on the government to legalize freedom.
Right.
You can just go ahead and do it. You can just be free. And like there's philosophical positions outside of that. And I think that can be kind of a downside that we run into in what so-called flyover country, with our friends and neighbors, just trying to explain to them like, there's other ways.
Right.
And then things like Bitcoin, then we're trying to talk to them about things like that, and they're just like, well, I don't know. I've got my dollar and I've got my credit card. These are tangible things that I can hold on to.
Right.
And I don't know. You're talking about magical numbers on a computer. I don't know about that. And that can be kind of hard as well. Trying to explain to them like, no, actually these numbers on a computer are actually more solid than your dollar and your credit card are.
Yeah, you tell people that any good attribute of gold, Bitcoin's better at it than that. And they just they freeze because it just doesn't compute. People don't understand. And to a point, rightly so. But they don't understand that something that's purely digital can be more scarce. Since the beginning of computers, copying and pasting has destroyed the value of digital items because there's no way to have digital scarcity. And Bitcoin did that, and because it's scarce and because it's digital, those two combinations have immense ramifications. The biggest one is like absolute scarcity. You can prove how much Bitcoin exists right now. You can prove how much Bitcoin will exist in a year, in 100 years, and you can know for certain. And you can't say that about gold, which is scarce, and you definitely can't say that about the US dollar, which is very much not scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, and then I tell people that, and they're just like, you lost me at scarce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the horrible. How do I say this? That's just the horrible dilemma that we find ourselves in. We who are in and love rural and flyover Americans is, on the one hand, it's their simplicity and the fact that they don't get into these things. That is their strength, and what makes us love them in so many ways is like, oh, God bless you. You don't get into online debates with journalists and stuff like that. Like, God bless you. You just live your life, don't you?
Right.
That's great. And at the same time, you're like, there are things that do take thought and consideration that will improve your life. And I get it from two different directions too. Like, I get it on the political and economic side, and also in my day-to-day life, as a pastor, I'm trying to convince them to like, okay, think a little deeply about your faith. Think a little deeply about the Bible. One of my biggest two things that I despise almost more than anything is bumper sticker theology and sentimental Christianity, which takes, bumper stickers try and sum everything down into one tight, cute little phrase you can put on a bumper sticker, and a lot of times more complicated than that, and also sentimental Christianity, which is like just attaches to anything that's cute or makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside, and ignores some of the harder teachings of the Bible. And I'm trying to convince people to use their brains more, and it can be so hard because of that same sense. And of course, you know, like you said, we are stereotyping. There's wisdom in rural Americans, and like I said, in some ways it is the fact that they don't get into these philosophical debates, and yet a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of theology can be very helpful in trying to convince them not to lose the, you know, work with your hands, know your neighbors, love your neighbors aspect, and also to somewhat think a little bit deeper. It can be hard, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the dilemma I find myself in so often, you know. And it's very similar to like another dilemma that I thought of while you were talking was the dilemma between localism and comparative advantage that often comes up in economics, that certain countries have comparative advantage in areas, and trade between those countries can be helpful.
Right.
Like, you know, the division of labor. So what's the you know, it's kind of like what's the best. It's kind of like on one side we're looking at it from political philosophy and decentralization of everything, and localism is, and then also from a more economic perspective, like, well, yeah, but also trade and division of labor can be helpful because it makes prices go down, but also you don't know who's making that, you know, where you don't know if you trust the person.
Right. And so
it's all just, there's comparing values, you know.
I look at that. I mean, yes, there's the strict economic comparison, supply and demand, comparative advantage, all of that. But I look at it sometimes from the fragility versus anti-fragility spectrum, if you will, and that is kind of what has led me towards my opinions in Agorism, where yes, buying things on Amazon is oftentimes the cheapest thing, and if not, Target's right behind it. And there are times where, as a capitalist, I'm just going for the cheapest thing that supplies a good at the quality that I need. I'm going to buy the cheapest one. You know, money's tight right now. We're a single income household. I just took a pay cut to get a new job. We're going to do more of that going forward. But at the same time, that is a fragile system where if, for whatever reason, I'm talking apocalyptic scenarios, they're unlikely. But if Amazon stops working, if Target stops working, where do I get my things? And from a fragility perspective, it behooves me to start networking and start finding suppliers in the area who I may not be able to buy all the time from them, or even a majority of the time from them, but enough to remain a contact with them so that if the world falls apart and Amazon stops working and I can't get things delivered to my door in 2 days, but instead would have to wait 5 days, I could just go to my friend down the road and get it from him. And that is because on a practical sense, capitalism is the best financial option there is, but on a fragility sense, it might not be, except for hyper-local capitalism. And it's just the awareness of, I need to start looking. Like, I have no answers. I don't know. I have no rubric for when I'm going to buy local versus just going online, but I have no awareness of local right now, and that needs to change. Or at least if I have the awareness, I can make an educated decision. But right now, I can't make an educated decision because I don't know.
Right. Right. And maybe that's just, I sometimes wonder if there's a sense in which the way economies work just sort of happens this way, of like, this would probably be a sociological or historical study, which I'm not prepared to do, of like a sense in which there is a centralizing and decentralizing effect that just happens. You know, like as systems develop, it often early on makes most sense to centralize and have like the experts explain. and then there's kind of an expansion that happens at that central area, and then eventually it widens to a point where it can't hold anymore. Then it has to kind of naturally separate, you know? I think of the way that like I mean, like church history, you know, that's where my mind always goes, you know, like there was a sense in which it made most sense to center all of the churches on these big areas of these big cities, you know, these main cities where the bishop there would tell everyone, okay, what does the Bible say? What are we supposed to believe? Because they were the ones who had the time, they had the ability, and they would sort of they would put money into these bishops, and they would tell them in turn what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to read the Bible, or how you're supposed to understand, you know, because a lot of them didn't have Bibles to read. And then, of course, that just moves up and more into the centrality of Rome. And then suddenly Protestant Reformation happens, and it's like the whole thing kind of collapsed. I mean, at least from my perspective, you know, obviously if we have any Roman Catholic listeners, they're going to disagree with me. But I think even there, like there's a sense in which this decentralization helped. I've often said, and I think even some Roman Catholic scholars have said, that the decentralization of the Protestant Reformation helped the Catholic Church in some ways. But you've also got like that happening in many ways around the country with these like multi-site movements where these churches will grow around this one main pastor who's got kind of this distinctive voice and vision, and it grows and grows. I think of that the Mars Hill Church on the coasts that all gathered around Mark Driscoll, who, you know, that was always kind of questionable a little bit, but then all of a sudden this massive multi-site church around the whole coast of the U.S., suddenly their scandal breaks out, and Driscoll gets fired, and all of these all these churches all centered around this one location suddenly decentralize rapidly and quickly, and now they all have to figure out how to do things locally. Like there's a sense in which maybe that's just the way that societies work, you know? Like, you know, Rome grows big and grows into an empire, and then suddenly falls apart, and they have to decentralize into these local nation states, you know? The U.S., the British Empire spreads abroad, and then suddenly it decentralizes into these local, or back into these local nation states. The U.S. empire is exploding and expanding abroad, and it does bring a lot of capitalistic and technological benefits. There are benefits in some senses. You know, the Pax Romana brought many benefits, but it was unstable and it was impossible to keep up, and eventually just decentralizes, and it often is uncomfortable when it does. And I think so there's something to what you're saying of like, what we are enjoying right now is in many ways what someone unironically called on Twitter the Pax Americana. And I think there's a sense in which that is what's happening, like, right? Like the U.S. has its hand in everything, and is in some ways with its military might enforcing the trade routes and causing this all to happen. But the question is it, like you said, is it fragile? And
right.
And is it becoming more and more so as it continues to expand?
And the answer is yes.
And what happens when it falls apart? Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely is. And are we ready for the uncomfortable thing that's going to happen when it does fall apart? Like, I think Malice is right that secession is the answer moving forward. Like, secession has to be the answer. There's no way that this country, the whole conceit of the United States was a foolish one. There has to be a breakdown, but it's not going to be comfortable. I think that's something that maybe an aspect of it that isn't being talked about is it's going to be uncomfortable, and we need to be ready for what comes next.
Yeah, I think.
And yeah,
secession. I think it is inevitable, but I don't think it has to be a conscious decision on the part of a group or a state. Where if history will repeat itself, or as they say, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. If history looks the same, the United States will get so overburdened and unwieldy that it will fall apart on its own. And so, yeah, Texas may leave. But my theory is, just like what happened to Rome, just like what happened to the British Empire, just like what happened to the Roman Catholic Church, it gets to the point where it cannot actually serve the people that it's there to serve. It cannot produce anything useful, and people will realize it, and then they will just, stop. Like, imagine, if you will, the U.S. government has all these crazy laws. I think the omnibus included some legislation that said sharing memes is illegal. That is that's a bit of an overstatement, but something to do with that. I don't really care because that's my point. It's unenforceable. Are they going to go find every single person? And so they've created a law that they cannot enforce. At which point, if the United States ever gets more unwieldy or just weaker, there will be more laws that they cannot enforce. So the anti-money laundering laws that all money service businesses have to do, and I was involved with when I ran a Bitcoin ATM, those laws exist, and right now they're being enforced. At what point, and it will be eventually, when will those laws, they won't go away, they won't be repealed, they just won't be enforced because there won't be people to enforce it. And the answer to the when, of course, is uncertain, but the answer to the why is the money that the enforcers are being paid in order to enforce will not be valuable. This happens to every entity, if you consider the concept of value or value. For the Roman Catholic Church, their value was salvation. They had a monopoly on salvation. And then Martin Luther said, well, you really don't, and you can't really enforce it. I'm out. And so, like, right now, the US dollar is the global reserve currency. It is a behemoth, and it's what allows the U.S. to do whatever the hell it wants in the world, because we can just print more of it. But printing money causes inflation, which causes more printing, which causes more inflation, and eventually, every single fiat currency in the world ends in hyperinflation. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is about 27 years. The lifespan of the U.S. will hit 50 years the lifespan of the US dollar as a fiat currency will hit 50 years in 2021. And it will end. Unless Jesus comes back first, the US dollar as a currency will go away. And that will be the end of the US as we know it. I don't know when. I'm not predicting when. It could be in 5 years. It could be in 500. I really don't know. But getting back to the falling apart and the crumbling of the U.S. empire, once the laws and the rules and the policies are unenforceable, not because they're repealed, but because the people who would be enforcing them aren't going to, that is when you will see the nation states, or even the city states, come together, where municipalities will issue their own currencies, or will just use Bitcoin or something. Maybe they'll go to a gold standard. And they'll just say, well, we can't trust this currency anymore. The US dollar's $1 million of federal aid that we used to get every year, that's not showing up anymore. And when it does, it buys us a cup of coffee. And so it won't be like an act of treason or an act of rebellion. It will be an act of survival. They will stop participating with the US because if they didn't, they would die too. And so I really see that the U.S. dollar and the U.S. government is strong, is powerful, but is exceptionally fragile. And whenever the fail happens, it will be hard. And going back to what we said about localism, the farmers in flyover country will be the most able to survive it because they know the person who's slaughtering the cow to give them the meat. They're farmers. They know how to fix everything, so their car will still running. It's the tech bros in Silicon Valley that are going to have the hardest time. And I'm not trying to bash any professions, but the theater people in New York, as well as most people with a liberal arts degree, that are gonna have a hard time, and probably me too. Let's be real.
Yeah. Well, it's. It's funny, like that was something that I remember I saw someone make a comment about, like, what if someone in one of those leftist states, and they were like, oh, it's funny that all these middle Americans want to kick us out of their country or secede from our country. Well, good luck when most of the GDP comes out of the blue states. And I'm like, well, good luck when most of your food comes from the red states. Like, you can't eat $1. You're not gonna eat your credit card. Like, you can't. You're gonna need us still. And so, your GDP. Yeah, sure, your GDP that comes from you. But that's kind of based on our work, And I think that's like you said, like that's there. I think in the collapse, whenever it happens, people are going to be glad to live in the unimportant places of America where the Hicks and Rubes and people who don't matter live, because I think they are going to be, like you said, more prepared to deal with it. And yet, a lot of farmers are making their money on corn that is going to these megacorp oil companies, and that's I think it's going to be a little uncomfortable for them too. Like, we all benefit. Like, I've been reading a lot of the Book of Revelation, and I was reading through the fall of the Whore of Babylon, and the next page is all the merchants bemoaning her fall, because while the whore was a tyrant, she did allow for greater financial flourishing, but it was based on immorality and fragility. Those two things are hand in hand. Like, it's based on immorality. One of the things that they're trading is human souls. That's what, one of the things they say, human souls, so slaves. And it's all based on a system that could never last. One of the things I think it's so fascinating that, like, I'm thinking about doing a deep dive on the political ramifications of Revelation, and so look out for that. That might be coming your way, dear listener. But they actually, one of the things that the Book of Revelation describes is that though the Whore of Babylon, who in my opinion represents Rome, is riding on the back of the beast, which I believe represents the Roman Empire. Though she rides on the beast's back, the beast hates her and looks for an opportunity to kill her. There's a sense that even in his very different language, he's not using economic language, but he sees this concept of you could call it fragility, like you've been calling it, this concept that the empire eventually eats itself.
Right.
And that's really what he's describing, is the empire based on Rome eventually destroyed Rome. And that's what happened. Like, this was written predicting her fall hundreds of years in advance. And that's what happened. We know that's what happened. Like, the barbarians invaded Rome, but really she was dead a long time before the barbarians invaded.
Right. Yeah.
And so, I think, you're right. It's gonna, there are economic advantages, but it's unsustainable. It's going to all come crashing down. It's based on, and again, for the same reasons, it's based on immorality and fragility. It's going to, it can't last. And so, I guess there's one of two options. Either get ready for the collapse and prepare yourself, or enjoy the party while it's still on. Or maybe some combination of both,
And pray that Jesus comes back first.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, like it's, so I try to have a pretty I consider it realist faith. Most people consider me to be cynical and pessimistic, which I will grant them that. They're right. But America will fail unless Jesus comes back first. Is as true of a statement as I will die unless Jesus comes back first. Everything that involves humans, which is everything in the physical world, will fall apart unless Jesus comes back first. And so that includes the US dollar, and that includes Bitcoin. I mean, who knows? Like, I don't know the time frame for that. But the only solution that actually matters for anything more than 2 or 3 human generations is Jesus.
you know, Isaiah also says all the nations of the earth are a drop in the bucket,
right,
to God, to Yahweh, to the Lord, and it's true. You know, you look back, and I made a tweet about this the other day where I was like, there was one time, and this was meant to be kind of an encouragement to people who are looking at the inevitability of the United States, and also a thought provoker to people who think that the United States is just what it is. And I said, the Roman Empire was once thought inevitable and undefeatable, and yet she fell.
Right.
And then I made another tweet a little bit later to provoke some of my, because I travel in kind of two circles. I travel in libertarian and Austro-libertarian circles, and I also travel in Reformed Christian circles. And my thought provoker to them was, the Christianization of Rome did not prevent her fall. John predicts her fall in the book of Revelation, and in between that and the fall of Rome, she became Christianized.
Right.
But that didn't stop her fall.
Right.
Like, the answer is not make America Christian. The answer is recognize that the empire will always fall.
Right.
And so get on the side of the right king.
Because if America needed to be a Christian nation for Jesus's plan to be fulfilled, Jesus would have bowed down and worshipped Satan when he had the chance. Jesus did not come to save America. It's not make America Christian again. It's make the souls of the people who live in this country and that other country Christian again. And like, I don't even remember what is why did the nations rage, wherever that is.
Psalm 2.
Like, we plan a lot of things and we get very angry when they don't work, and none of it actually matters except Christ and him crucified.
Yeah. All right. So I think Bro Rothbard's going to be furious with us that we went way past 30 minutes, but you know what? I said you're going to get to know our friend Daribely or Daribely, whatever we're pronouncing this name.
Yeah, that's cool. We can have a raffle someday, and whichever one gets the most. I'll put out a couple. Bitcoin addresses, and you can send me money. And whichever one gets the most money is how I'll pronounce it going forward.
Sure. That's great. Yeah. So I told you you're gonna get to know him, and you did. That was the whole point. And so I hope you're excited to hear more from us as we three as a team go forward. We've got some plans to kind of make 2021 a little bit bigger than what we were last year. Last year we were just kind of dipping our toes in the podcasting world and figuring it out, and hopefully this year we're gonna come at it a little bit more seriously and with a bit of more of a plan. We'll let you know when we have it. But yeah, we're gonna wrap it right here. We thank you for listening, and we hope that you are yourself, wherever you are, finding ways to carve out a little more liberty, and also that you're focusing on things that matter, things that not on things that are fragile and are going to collapse, but on things that are deeper and more valuable than things this world can give. So with that, thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, for cripe's sake, I forgot my intro. No, he's going to keep that in there, and he's going to use it as bonus, and he's going to be like, let's make Iowa Catholic stupid.